the bar erupts. Muzzle flashes strobe against wood paneling and neon beer signs. A man in a leather jacket takes 3 bullets in the chest and staggers backward into a row of stools. Glass shatters, someone screams. And Frankie Flannery, the boss, the king of the West Side, goes down in a hail of gunfire on a barroom floor, blood pooling across dirty tile while the jukebox still plays. That is how Hollywood killed Frankie Flannery. Ed Harris, face down on a prop floor, in Phil Jones's 1990 film, State of Grace. It is one of the most brutal mob deaths ever put on screen, and almost none of it is true. The real man behind Frankie Flannery, a Hell's Kitchen Irish gangster named Jimmy Coonan, ran an operation that killed somewhere between 15 and 40 people over the span of a decade. His crew did not just shoot their victims. They bled them in bathtubs. They cut them apart with hacksaws. They hung them on meat hooks, and when it was over, they bagged the pieces and dumped them in the Hudson River a few blocks from where they drank their Budweisers. In the time it took to watch a football game, a man could walk into one of their bars alive and leave in 6 garbage bags. But here is what the movie got most wrong. Frankie Flannery did not die in a barroom. The real man did not die at all. Not the way you think. Jimmy Coonan is alive right now, as you watch this video, sitting in a federal prison cell. His power did not end with bullets. It ended with a gavel, and the man who put him there was his own best friend. And the murder that actually mirrors Frankie's movie death, the killing that changed everything in Hell's Kitchen, happened to someone else entirely. A man named Mickey Spillane, shot 4 times on a quiet sidewalk, no slow motion, no soundtrack, just 4 bangs, a car door, and screeching tires. Who pulled the trigger? After nearly 50 years, nobody knows for certain. By the end of this video, you will know the real story of Frankie Flannery, the killings the movie could not show, the betrayal it barely hinted at, and the truth about how the most savage Irish gang in New York history actually ended. It was not like the movie. It was worse. If you are fascinated by the real stories behind Hollywood's most iconic mob movies, hit that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss one. We dig into the actual history every week. Now let me take you back to Hell's Kitchen, the real one, the one that smelled like blood and diesel. Mickey Spillane was born in 1933 and raised on the same blocks he would later control. He was a longshoreman's son, a product of the Irish tenement world that stretched along the west side of Manhattan from the docks to the avenues. By the early 1960s, he had become the man you went to on the west side for a loan, for protection, for permission. He ran gambling, loan sharking, and rackets around the docks from 34th Street to 57th Street, between 8th and 12th Avenues. About 1.5 miles of tenement-lined streets, narrow alleys, and walk-up apartments where the rent was cheap and the neighbors did not ask questions. He was 44 years old when the end came, married with children, lived modestly, no flashy cars, no penthouse. He kept his violence quiet, his bribes discreet, and his crew in line. The neighborhood called him a gentleman. That was meant as a compliment. Hell's Kitchen in the 60s and 70s was a place where you could hear the Hudson River when the wind shifted. Sodium streetlights turned everything orange at night. The bars had low ceilings and wood paneling stained brown by decades of cigarette smoke. Everyone knew everyone. The dock workers, the union stewards, the bookmakers, the guys who collected debts with a baseball bat, they were all neighbors, all cousins, all drinking buddies. Spillane's crew was maybe 20 or 30 men deep, with a loose web of dozens more who owed him favors or depended on his goodwill. They were not the Italian Mafia. They were the Irish Mafia, or as close to it as the West Side had ever produced. And then there was Jimmy Coonan, born 1946, 13 years younger than Spillane, same neighborhood, same Irish blood, completely different animal. Coonan did not want to manage rackets. He wanted to own them. As a teenager, he was already known as a kid who would hit first and hit hard. Robberies, collections, street fights that went further than they needed to. He had no real education beyond what the older gangsters taught him. By his mid-20s, he was openly challenging Spillane's authority, pulling stunts that the old boss would never have approved. He was reckless in the way that young men who feel invincible tend to be, but there was something else underneath it, a calculated ambition that separated him from the rest of the neighborhood brawlers. Coonan called himself a protector of the neighborhood. He told the Irish families of Hell's Kitchen that he was one of them, that he would keep the streets safe. But the alliance he was building, quietly, deliberately, was with the Gambino crime family, the most powerful Italian mafia operation in New York. He was selling Hell's Kitchen to the very people the neighborhood had spent decades keeping out. That is not protection. That is a hostile takeover wearing a friendly face. Think about that for a second. The man who claimed to be the Irish protector of an Irish neighborhood was the one who opened the door and invited the Italian mafia inside. Everything that came after, the murders, the dismemberments, the bodies in the river, traces back to that one contradiction. And on the other side of this, the men in Spillane's orbit, the older Irish guys, the dock workers and bar owners, watched all of this with a sick feeling in their guts. They called Coonan's people animals. They said the kid had no respect. Many of them were no angels themselves. They had broken legs and rigged union votes and squeezed money out of small businesses for years. But they had a code, or at least they told themselves they did. You did not kill unless you had to. You did not make the front page. You did not butcher people. They looked at what was coming and they understood, in the way old men understand a storm, that their world was ending. These were men in their 50s and 60s, many of them fathers and grandfathers, who had grown up believing that the West Side belonged to its own people. They were wrong, of course. It belonged to whoever was willing to be the most violent. But they did not know that yet. By 1975, Coonan had assembled the crew that the NYPD and the newspapers would soon call the Westies. There were maybe 15 to 20 core members at their peak, with another 20 or 30 on the periphery, associates, hangers-on, guys who did favors and looked the other way. That is not an army. That is a bar full of men with guns. But what they lacked in numbers they made up for in pure, calculated savagery. The most dangerous of them was a man named Mickey Featherstone. He was a Hell's Kitchen kid, Irish-American, late 20s during the worst of it. He had served in Vietnam, real combat, not a desk job, and he had come home wrong. Flashbacks, paranoia, a temper that could go from zero to murder in the space of a sentence. He had been decorated for bravery in a foreign war, and now he was using those same skills to execute men in the back rooms of West Side bars. The United States government had trained him to kill. Jimmy Coonan gave him a reason to keep doing it. Let that land for a moment. Mickey Featherstone had gone to war for his country. He had risked his life in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And then he came home to Hell's Kitchen and fought a different war against his own neighbors, his own people. The skills that were supposed to protect America were now being used to dismember bodies in a bar on 10th Avenue. Their headquarters, if you could call it that, was the 596 Club on 10th Avenue. From the outside, it looked like every other dive bar in the neighborhood, neon beer signs in the window, a jukebox in the corner, the permanent haze of Marlboro smoke. From the inside, it was an office, a courthouse, and when Coonan decided, a slaughterhouse. The weapons of choice were small, 22s, 25s, 38 caliber pistols, nothing flashy. The kind of guns you could tuck in a waistband and forget about until you needed them. The Westies did not wage war with machine guns. They waged it with whiskey, trust, and a bullet to the back of the head. The reason the Westies mattered beyond their neighborhood, the reason they went from local thugs to a federal case, was the Gambino family. Coonan had done what Spillane refused to do. He cut a deal with the Italians. Specifically, he established a working relationship with Gambino capo Roy DeMeo, and, through him, with boss Paul Castellano. The arrangement was simple. The Gambinos had hundreds of made men and associates across New York City. They had money, political connections, and legal muscle. The Westies had something the Italians wanted, a crew of Irish killers willing to do the dirty work that made men preferred not to touch. Contract killings. Enforcement. The kind of violence that was too savage even for the Mafia's reputation. In exchange, Coonan got protection, a cut of larger rackets, and the understanding that Hell's Kitchen was his to run, as long as the Gambinos got their share. It was the classic deal with the devil. Short-term power, long-term destruction. Because when the FBI came, and they would come, the Italian connection would turn a local gang investigation into a sprawling federal RICO case that would bury them all. Here is the math that should chill you. 15 to 20 men, a territory of about 20 square blocks. And between them, law enforcement estimates they killed 30 to 40 people over 10 years. That is roughly one body every 3 months from a group small enough to fit in a single bar. Per capita, the Westies may have been the most lethal organized crime unit in American history. The choice that killed Mickey Spillane was not made on the night he was shot. It was made years earlier in a series of quiet conversations and firm refusals that sealed his fate as surely as any bullet. By the mid-1970s, the Gambino family had made it clear: cooperate or step aside. They wanted a piece of the West Side. The docks, the construction rackets around the planned Jacob Javits Convention Center, the union money that flowed through Hell's Kitchen like groundwater. Spillane could have made a deal. He could have carved up his territory, given the Italians their percentage, and lived out his years as a comfortable middle manager in someone else's empire. That was the smart play. Every man around him knew it. But Mickey Spillane had spent his entire adult life building something that was, in its way, independent, Irish. His. He had watched the Italian families absorb one neighborhood after another, turning local bosses into errand boys. He was not going to let that happen on the West Side. Not on his watch. He told the Italians no, not in a dramatic speech, not with a gun drawn. Just no. A firm, repeated, quiet refusal to bend. Whether Spillane understood what that refusal would cost him, we cannot know for certain. He was not a stupid man. He had survived decades in a world where refusal often meant death. Perhaps he believed his relationships with local cops and union men would protect him. Perhaps he believed the Italians would accept the boundary. Or perhaps he simply could not imagine being anything other than what he was, the boss of his own neighborhood, answerable to no one but himself and the men who had followed him for 20 years. What we do know is that his refusal made him a problem. And in the world Spillane inhabited, problems had a way of ending up on the sidewalk. The night of May 13th, 1977, was already written. Spillane just did not know it yet. The gunmen were already being chosen, the date was already set. And somewhere in Hell's Kitchen, Jimmy Coonan was waiting for the phone call that would make him king. May 13th, 1977. A mild spring evening in Manhattan. The light is fading over the West Side, turning the tenement facades along 10th Avenue into shadows. On West 20th Street, near the corner, the sodium streetlights are just flickering on, casting their orange glow over parked cars and fire escapes. Mickey Spillane is walking home. He is 44 years old. He has been the boss of Hell's Kitchen for the better part of 2 decades. He is not, at this moment, thinking about the Gambinos or Jimmy Coonan or the rackets. He is a man walking home. 4 men approach. The details of their faces, their clothes, their exact positions on the sidewalk are lost to history. No one who saw them clearly lived to testify with certainty. What the neighbors heard was this: 4 bangs, quick, so close together they almost sounded like one long crack, then a car door, then screeching tires, then nothing for a beat, then a woman screaming. Spillane was hit 4 times, head and chest. He went down on the sidewalk outside his own building. There was no dramatic final speech, no staggering into the street clutching a wound. He was dead or dying before anyone reached him. Estimated time from the first shot to his last breath: under 2 minutes. A man who had controlled 20 blocks of Manhattan for 20 years erased in the time it takes to boil an egg. To this day, no one has been formally charged with the murder of Mickey Spillane. Three theories have circulated for nearly 50 years. The first, Joe Mad Dog Sullivan, an Irish-American freelance hitman who did contract work for the Italian families. Sullivan was known for exactly this kind of job: walk up, shoot, disappear. An Irishman killing an Irish boss at the behest of Italians. The second theory, a Gambino crew did it directly, with Coonan's knowledge and tacit approval. The third, Coonan's own men pulled the trigger, acting on Italian orders but doing the work themselves. The truth may never be known with certainty. Here is the irony that should stop you. Mickey Spillane spent his life keeping the Italian Mafia out of Hell's Kitchen. He refused every deal they offered, and the murder that ended his life may well have been carried out by a fellow Irishman, hired by the very Italians Spillane had spent his career resisting. If that is what happened, then the last thing Spillane saw was the face of his own people, doing the work of his enemies. Within days of Spillane's death, the old order in Hell's Kitchen began to collapse. His remaining loyalists scattered. Some aligned with Coonan, seeing which way the wind was blowing. Some simply disappeared, left the neighborhood, changed their names, found jobs in New Jersey or Westchester, and tried to pretend they had never been involved. The message was clear to everyone on the West Side. The gentleman gangster was dead. The butchers had arrived. With Spillane gone and the Gambino alliance in place, Jimmy Coonan stepped into the vacuum. He was 31 years old. He now controlled the loan-sharking, gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering across Hell's Kitchen. The Javits Center construction zone, the waterfront unions, the bars and businesses that paid protection, all of it now funneled through Coonan and, by extension, through the Gambino family. The kid who had started as a leg breaker was now the boss. But here is what you need to understand about the 596 Club, the bar where the Westies did most of their business. At 6 o'clock on any given evening, it looked like any other neighborhood dive. Men drinking beer after work, a jukebox playing rock and country. Smoke so thick it stung your eyes. And in the back room, behind a door that was always slightly cracked, the business of murder was discussed with the same casual tone as tomorrow's weather. The men who drank at that bar lived in two worlds simultaneously, and some of them would end up on the wrong side of the back room door. What emerged was not random violence. It was a system. A protocol. If someone needed to be killed, a debtor, a suspected informer, a rival, the method was almost always the same: lure the target to a bar or apartment, someone they trusted. Buy them a drink. Let them relax. Then a single shot to the back of the head, usually a small-caliber pistol. Quick, quiet. The next part was not quiet at all. For years, the Westies had operated in a gap between law enforcement jurisdictions. The NYPD organized crime squads knew about them, but lacked the manpower and legal tools to bring a comprehensive case. The FBI was focused primarily on the Italian families. The Westies fell into a blind spot, too Irish for the Mafia task forces, too connected to the Mafia for the local cops. But that was about to change. The men investigating the Westies came from the same world as the men they were chasing. Irish-American cops from Queens, Italian-American FBI agents from the Bronx, working-class New Yorkers who had grown up on streets that looked a lot like Hell's Kitchen. One NYPD detective who worked the case later described it as like chasing medieval barbarians with law books. They knew what was happening. They knew about the bodies. They just could not prove it. Not yet. What the Westies did not realize was that their own methods, the very dismemberments that were supposed to hide the evidence, would eventually betray them. Bodies that were supposed to disappear forever had a way of surfacing, literally. And when one particular body washed up on the New Jersey shoreline, everything changed. But that is a story for the next part. Because what happened inside the 596 Club on the night of October 13th, 1978, would become the single most infamous act in the history of the Irish mob in America. And it started with a man named Patty Dugan walking through the front door, smiling, expecting a drink with friends. Patrick "Paddy" Dugan was somewhere in his mid-30s to early 40s, Irish-American, a minor associate of the Westies, odd jobs, low-level bookmaking, some debt collection. He was not a made man, he was not a soldier. He was a guy from the neighborhood who hung around the edges of the crew because it made him feel important. He drank at the same bars, he knew the same people, he called Coonan and Featherstone by their first names. That familiarity was the most dangerous thing about him. Coonan suspected Dugan of two unforgivable sins: skimming money and talking to law enforcement. In the Westies world, either one was a death sentence. Both together meant something worse than death. It meant a death designed to be remembered, a death that would echo through the neighborhood like a gunshot through a hallway. If you have seen State of Grace, you have seen a version of what happens next, sanitized, scored with music, filmed through a Hollywood lens. What actually happened in the back room of the 596 Club on October 13th, 1978, was not cinematic. It was not dramatic. It was butcher's work, performed by men who had done it before and would do it again. And the details come not from screenwriters, but from the sworn testimony of the men who held the knives. On the evening of October 13th, 1978, Dugan walked into the 596 Club. He had been invited. A friendly summons: come by, have a drink, there is something we need to talk about. The bar was doing its usual business. Neon signs. Smoke. Laughter. Jukebox. Dugan sat down. Someone bought him a beer. He was among friends, or so he believed. Somewhere in that bar, behind the door to the back room, plastic sheeting had already been laid on the floor. Before we get to Dugan's last moments, there is another victim you need to know about, because his death set the clock that would eventually destroy everything. Ruby Stein was in his mid-60s, Jewish, not Irish. A veteran loan shark who had operated across Manhattan for decades, extending credit to bookies, gamblers, and small-time mobsters from every ethnic background. He had survived by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. He was the kind of man who believed that money made him safe. It did not. Stein was lured to a meeting on the promise of debt repayment. Someone owed him money. That was all. He came to collect, and when he walked in, the men who owed him that money put a bullet in the back of his head. They bled him. They cut him apart. They bagged the pieces and dumped them in the river. It was the same method, the same cold protocol: invite, trust, kill, dismember, dispose. But Stein's body refused to stay gone. Days or weeks later, accounts vary, remains washed up on the New Jersey shoreline. Inside were what was left of Ruby Stein. This was the break that law enforcement had been waiting for without knowing it. An identifiable victim, connected to loan sharking networks that crossed ethnic and geographic lines. Suddenly, the Westies were not just a local Irish gang with a reputation for violence. They were tied to a major murder victim whose case could unravel an entire network. The FBI opened a focused investigation into the West Side rackets. They began assembling a timeline, connecting names, mapping relationships. The slow, methodical work of building a federal case had begun, and the Westies, busy with their own internal wars and their Gambino paymasters, had no idea. The body in the river had started a clock. It would take years to run out, but it was ticking. Back at the 596 Club, on the night of October 13th, 1978, Dugan finishes his beer. He may have had more than one. At some point he is taken, or walks willingly, toward the back of the bar, into the room where the plastic sheeting waits. And there, in that dim space, with its single bare bulb casting yellowish light on the concrete floor, someone puts a gun to the back of Patty Dugan's head and pulls the trigger. In the time it takes you to read this paragraph, about 30 seconds, Patty Dugan went from alive to dead to a problem that needed to be solved. Everything that follows is what that solution looked like. Years later, in a federal courtroom in Manhattan, Mickey Featherstone described what happened next. His words were flat, almost clinical, the voice of a man who had learned to kill in Vietnam and had never learned to stop. We cut him up, because Jimmy wanted everybody to know what happens when you cross him, Featherstone told the jury. It wasn't just about getting rid of the body. The body was laid out on the plastic sheeting. Knives and a hacksaw were the primary tools. The iron smell of blood filled the room, overwhelming and metallic, mixing with the stale beer and cigarette smoke that seeped through the walls from the bar's front room. A radio was playing somewhere. Traffic hummed on 10th Avenue. Outside, the neighborhood was having a normal Friday night. Inside, men were taking a human body apart, piece by piece, in a process that was as methodical as it was horrifying. This is what the movie could never show you. Not really. Not the sound of a hacksaw through bone. Witnesses described it as like cutting wet wood. Not the reality of a floor so slick that boots stuck and slid in it. Not the fact that some of the men in that room went silent while they worked, and at least one fought the urge to be sick. This was not a movie scene. This was a Tuesday night in Hell's Kitchen. The process took between 1 and 2 hours. When it was done, the remains were placed in plastic bags. The bags were loaded into a car. The drive from the 596 Club to the Hudson River piers was only a few blocks, maybe 300 to 600 meters, short enough to walk, close enough that you could hear the water from the bar where you had just cut someone apart. The bags went into the river, and Patty Dugan, the neighborhood guy who thought he was one of the boys, ceased to exist. No body was ever publicly recovered. His fate lives on only in the words of the men who killed him. A cooperating witness, later identified only as Bay, explained the logic in terms that could not be misunderstood. The dismemberment served a second purpose beyond hiding evidence, he told investigators. Coonan wanted to send a message to the neighborhood, to Spillane's old crew, to anyone who might consider crossing him. They spread the word deliberately. This is what happens when you cross Jimmy C. The story of what happened to Dugan became a kind of initiation myth. New Westies associates would hear it and understand. Loyalty is not optional. Between 1978 and 1983, the Westies operated at the peak of their power. Coonan was in his mid-30s. He ran loan sharking, extortion, labor racketeering in the Javits Center zone, and contract killings for the vast Gambino machine they had sold their souls to. A crew of barely 20 men terrorizing a city of millions pulled in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, possibly more. The methods that had become their unofficial calling card kept the neighborhood silent. Bodies disappeared. The streets stayed quiet. Law enforcement would later estimate the total toll at somewhere between 30 and 40 over the decade between the early 70s and mid-80s. The hard documented count, the ones that could be proven in court, is closer to 10 or 15. The gap between those numbers tells its own story. Somewhere in that gap are the victims who were never found, the men whose bags sank deep enough in the Hudson to stay down, the people whose names were simply erased from the neighborhood's memory. But empires built on fear have a structural flaw. The same terror that keeps people loyal also makes them desperate. By 1983, a series of arrests on weapons, drug, and assault charges were putting pressure on the edges of the Westies. Minor associates were flipping on larger crimes. The FBI investigation that had begun with a body washing up on the Jersey Shore was growing, feeding on each new piece of testimony. And Mickey Featherstone, the combat veteran who could not stop fighting, was about to become the most dangerous man, not to the crew's enemies, but to the crew itself. In 1984, Featherstone was charged with a murder he insisted he did not commit. The evidence would later suggest, and cooperating witnesses would confirm, that Coonan's own people may have framed him. Deliberately. Featherstone had become too volatile, too unpredictable, too much of a liability. Rather than kill him, which would have been difficult and risky, they let the justice system do it. Featherstone was convicted. He was looking at decades in prison for something he did not do, and as he sat in his cell staring at the walls, something inside him shifted. The most feared enforcer in the history of the Irish mob in New York was about to make a choice, and it would destroy everything Jimmy Coonan had built. Picture Mickey Featherstone in a prison cell, a man who had survived Vietnam, a man who had killed, by his own admission and by the testimony of others, multiple people in the service of Jimmy Coonan's empire. A man with a hair-trigger temper, with flashbacks and paranoia, and the kind of damage that combat leaves in the neural pathways like scar tissue. And now he was behind bars for a murder he said he did not commit. His own crew had put him here. His own boss, Featherstone, stewed. He had gone to war for Coonan, literally used the killing skills the United States Army had given him, and this was the repayment. A frame-up. A convenient removal. While Coonan sat in that smoke-stained back room and collected money and ran the neighborhood, Featherstone rotted in a cell and counted the years he would never get back. The man who had been all business when it came to killing now turned that same cold calculation on the question of loyalty. And the answer he arrived at was simple. There was none left to give. In mid-1985, Featherstone reached out through his lawyer to federal authorities. The message was straightforward. He had names, he had dates, he had details, the killings, the dismemberments, the meetings with Gambino representatives, the structure of the entire operation. He could give them Coonan. He could give them the Westies. He could give them the Italian connection. All of it. In exchange, he wanted protection, and he wanted a shot at overturning the conviction that had put him behind bars. Years later, in an account of his decision that has been paraphrased in multiple sources, Featherstone put it in terms that cut through every layer of mob mythology. I went to war with him, and he sold me out. I wasn't going to do the rest of my life for a murder I didn't do while Jimmy sat on his throne. That is the voice of a man who has crossed a line from which there is no return. In the world Featherstone came from, what he was about to do was the ultimate sin, worse than murder, worse than theft, worse than any crime on the books. He was going to become a rat. Over months, Featherstone gave the FBI everything, lists of victims, locations, methods. He described how men were killed and disposed of in that back room, the plastic sheeting, the tools, the systematic approach that had become their calling card and their downfall. He named the Gambino contacts. He explained the financial structures, the loan-sharking routes, the union rackets. The federal prosecutors listened and built their case brick by brick, each testimony session adding another layer to the RICO indictment that would bring it all crashing down. The prosecutors made a critical strategic decision. They would not pursue individual murder charges in isolation. They would use the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, to present the Westies as what they were, a criminal enterprise. One cohesive story of murder, conspiracy, extortion, and alliance with the Gambinos. Every killing, every disposal, every loan-sharking operation, all connected, all part of a single pattern. It was the legal equivalent of seeing the entire picture instead of just the individual brushstrokes. In late 1986, federal indictments came down. The press erupted. Irish Mafia smashed. Westies' boss faces life. Coonan and his co-defendant stood trial in the Southern District of New York, a federal courtroom in Manhattan, blocks from the neighborhood they had terrorized. Mickey Featherstone took the stand as the government's star witness. The man who had participated in the very acts he now described did so in the same flat voice, to a jury of 12 citizens who could barely comprehend what they were hearing. This is the moment the movie got completely, entirely, unforgivably wrong. In State of Grace, Frankie Flannery dies in a hail of bullets on a barroom floor. Slow motion, blood spray, the death of a king. In reality, the man who inspired Frankie Flannery, Jimmy Coonan, stood in a fluorescent-lit courtroom, in a suit and tie, and listened to his best friend describe how they had dismembered human beings together. There was no music, no slow motion, no glory, just the quiet, devastating click of a tape recorder and the scratch of a court stenographer's pen. In February of 1988, the jury came back. Guilty. Multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy under RICO. The federal judge who sentenced Coonan and his co-defendants did not mince words. The evidence before this court shows a level of savagery that is almost medieval, he said from the bench. Bodies shot, bled, and carved up, as if in a slaughterhouse. Coonan was sentenced to what amounted to life in federal prison. He was 41 years old. The math was simple. He would die behind bars. The Westies collapsed. Not gradually, completely. Without Coonan and with Featherstone testifying against them, there was no organization left. Remnants of Irish gangs continued to operate in Hell's Kitchen, but they were shadows, footnotes, men without a structure or a purpose. The lone shark whose body refused to stay hidden had started a chain of events that ended in this courtroom. The man who had tried to keep Hell's Kitchen civilized had been killed for nothing. His death had merely installed a regime that burned itself out in a decade of blood. 3 deaths, then. The one the movie invented, Frankie Flannery, shot in a bar. Beautiful and false. The one that actually happened on a sidewalk, Mickey Spillane, 4 quick shots, real and forgotten. And the one that ended the Westies, not a physical death at all, but a legal one, Jimmy Coonan, convicted, sentenced, erased from power by the testimony of the man he had betrayed. The movie chose the version that looked best on camera. The truth was uglier, quieter, and infinitely more damning. Jimmy Coonan is alive. As of this recording, he remains in federal prison, an aging man in his late 70s, a relic of a world that no longer exists. He reportedly maintained that rats and weak men brought him down, still refusing to acknowledge that it was his own betrayal of Featherstone that triggered everything. Mickey Featherstone entered witness protection. He lived somewhere under a different name, carrying the weight of everything he did and everything he revealed. Some accounts say he struggled with guilt and mental illness for years. Others say he found a measure of peace. No one outside the United States Marshal Service knows for certain. Hell's Kitchen is almost unrecognizable now. The tenement buildings are still there, some of them, but they are surrounded by high-rise apartments, farm-to-table restaurants, and off-Broadway theaters. Tourists walk past the spots where men were shot and bodies were loaded into cars, and they do not know it. The 596 Club, that half-mile strip of tenement's most infamous address, is gone. Whatever occupies that space now has no memory of what soaked into its floors. The neighborhood gentrified so thoroughly that the old Westies territory is now one of the most expensive zip codes in Manhattan. State of Grace is a good movie. Gary Oldman's performance as Jackie Flannery is extraordinary. Ed Harris as Frankie is menacing and magnetic. But the film does something that all mob movies do. It makes the violence beautiful. The barroom shootout that kills Frankie is choreographed like a ballet. The loyalty and betrayal play out like a Shakespearean tragedy. And that is exactly the problem. Because the real story is not beautiful. The real story is plastic sheeting on a concrete floor, and the smell of blood so strong it made men gag. The real story is a body in a garbage bag floating in the Hudson River. The real story is a man spending the rest of his life in a cell because his best friend told the truth. Here is something the movie will never tell you, and most accounts of the Westies skip over entirely. The dismemberments, the meat hooks, the hacksaws, the bathtub bleeding, were not the acts of men who had lost control. They were deliberate, calculated terror tactics. Coonan did not butcher bodies because he was crazy. He did it because it worked. The same way a medieval lord would display heads on spikes outside his castle, Coonan spread stories of what happened to his enemies. The Westies were not madmen. They were strategists who used madness as a brand. That distinction matters because it means the savagery was not an aberration. It was the business model. Remember the opening of this video. The barroom, the muzzle flashes, Frankie Flannery going down in a hail of gunfire. That never happened. The real ending was a courtroom, fluorescent lights, a judge reading a verdict, a man in a suit realizing that the rest of his life would be measured in cell blocks and prison meals. No music, no slow motion, no glory. That is the real death of Frankie Flannery. And it is somehow worse. If this story hit you the way it hit me, subscribe. We tell these stories every week. The real ones. The ones the movies leave out.